Oh, man, he ain't in the game.
Now tell me, don't you find black men got anything better to do than play games?
Sure I do, but your sister ain't home. Give me the damn ball, man.
Yeah, take it. I thought some righteous brothers like yourselves might be able to help us out, but I guess that ain't you.
Help who with what?
It's your community. That's who. Now, maybe you ain't know, but another kid died today.
Come on now, look, y'all, that's 3 this year. In the same spot.
Damn straight. No Reverend Slocum, he's having another vigil to put a stoplight in that corner. What I'm asking y'all is for some of you able black asses to calm down and be observers on them cops. Take down some badge numbers. They don't like pulling a whole lot of shit. Too many eyes on them. That's how y'all can help. Not by praying, but by watching.
You think the police care anything about a bunch of black people praying? Now, the community's been trying to get this stoplight put in since before my mother was a virgin.
That's been a long time.
Now, you think City Hall really cares about a bunch of black people having another prayer vigil at some goddamn church? Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. My name's Dean, and in this episode with my co-host Matt, we're talking with Vincent Lloyd, Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University. Vincent has a lot of really interesting work on race, theology, religion, and politics, and we're focusing on 2 articles he wrote. So the first one is called Theology and Real Politics on Huey P Newton, and it's in a forthcoming book called Renegotiating Power, Theology, and Politics. The second is called Mass Incarceration is Religion, and So is Abolition, with Josh Dubler. So we'll talk about Huey Newton as a religious figure, what it means to say mass incarceration and its resistance are both religion. We'll talk a little bit about coalitions between the left and religious folks and some things like that. So if anything in our conversation strikes you, give us a shout on Twitter or email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. Also be on the lookout for Vincent's forthcoming book with Josh Dubler called Break Every Yoke, Religion, Justice, and the Abolition of Prisons.
Okay. Well, yeah, so let's catch up a little bit about what we did over the last week or so. Yeah, so we're here with Vincent Lloyd. Vincent, what's up? What have you done in the last week? What things are noteworthy that you think you could tell us about?
It's nice to be with you. Thank you for having me. I have a 3.5-year-old daughter who I spend a lot of time with. So going to the library and reading a lot of books is the main activity. Children's books, not academic books. The other exciting thing that happened was the annual American CMOVE Association conference was hosted by Villanova. So I got to be part of that this past weekend. So that was fun to see. Excitement around this French mystical, revolutionary thinker, scholars from the political side, from the religious side, coming together for discussion around her work.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, for sure. I have a 2-year-old son. So, Vincent, what's your daughter's favorite book to read? I need some suggestions.
So we're really into the Fancy Nancy / Nancy Clancy series now, by Jane O'Connor. Yeah, she's really into accessories and fanciness. So this is up her alley.
That sounds my son is only into tractors, and like he's so easily appeased by things. It's like, does it have a picture of a tractor on it? Yes. Oh, perfect. Yeah, Dean, what have you been doing, man?
So I don't have children. I do have 2 rambunctious cats. They don't read, but I do read my academic books to them. So especially very hard ones. I usually read them out loud to try to understand what's going on. My computer crashed today as I was in the middle of my dissertation, and that was very frightening. So this afternoon I became sort of an amateur, paranoid IT person. It turned out it was all fine, but like I definitely lost like a few weeks of my life to all that stress all afternoon. So I don't know, that's still sort of consuming my thoughts, even though it all turned out to be okay. The trauma is still there.
Wow, that's 100% bad. That's terrible.
Losing a dissertation is not on my list of things to do.
No.
I guess in more fun news, that's kind of a downer. More fun news, the Institute for Christian Studies, where I go, we had like a big end of the year party, and that was super fun. So basically it's like an excuse to, I don't know, get together with the senior members and junior members, and there's alcohol involved, but not too much because, you know, Christian professional institution, but enough to like make things really fun. So my MA supervisor, Bob Sweetman, who's a historian, he retooled all these old 80s songs to be about Michel Foucault and performed them live to much applause. So yeah, I appreciate getting to see a different side of ICS folks. That's always a good opportunity.
Can you give an example of like one of the songs?
So one of them was the song Michelle, the Beatles song.
Oh God.
To naturally be about Michel Foucault. I won't sing it, but
Yeah.
I will say that there's an audio recording that exists, so it could surface one of these days. One day when we need Bob to do something really bad and he doesn't want to. So.
Yeah, good plan.
Yeah.
This week I've just been like teaching and grading and being piled under an ever increasing just like list of things I have to do at my school. And amongst them, this is part of why I'm so interested in talking with Vincent in a second about prisons, is they are letting me redesign our capstone course. And the theme is on mass incarceration. And I think that I don't know what they expect I'm going to do with it, or like what type of topics or what approach I'll bring to it. But like, in passing, I've like accidentally just like blurted out that it's about like prison abolition a few times, and no one's quite called me on it yet. But yeah, that's been my life, I guess, over the past week, is just assuming more and more duties. Vincent, you wrote a really cool essay called "Theology and Real Politics" on Huey P Newton. Dean and I both read it, and we really like it for a lot of reasons. So I guess maybe a good avenue into this larger conversation is, well, first, this is a podcast that's about like Christianity and leftist politics. And in the essay, you like talk pretty explicitly about Huey P Newton as like a Christ figure in political theology. So do you think that this should be like of interest to Christians specifically, or should Christians be more interested in the Black Panthers than they are already?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for reading the article and thinking about it with me. I've had the chance recently to revisit it as it's being included as a chapter in a book that's coming out this fall. So I sort of see the things that I regret and am reminded of some things that aren't so bad. I mean, in terms of this is sort of part of thinking more generally about radical Black politics as part of a tradition, and thinking about that tradition as not in secularist terms, not in terms that sort of exclude the religious, but quite the opposite, in terms that see the sort of movement of radical Black politics as a theological movement, and sort of get at that by looking at exemplary figures, but also exemplary practices, so community organizing practices, but also people like Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, George Jackson, Assata Shakur, as Steve Biko, right, as individuals who all deeply relate in some way with Christianity, even as it's being disclaimed in some cases, right? It's still formative. Mm-hmm. And so rather than just sort of either taking them at their word or sort of approaching individuals or practices like in the Black radical tradition as apart from Christianity or from theology, right? Seeing them as integrated and maybe even central to how we might understand the Christian theological tradition. Anyway, just like someone like Hegel could take spirit unfolding in European civilization, right? It seems like for us today, and thinking from a Christian theological perspective, looking at Black American experience and spirit unfolding in Black American experience in complex and sort of subtle ways, and particularly in struggle, is the sort of place to look to gain theological insights if we're looking for the perspective of the least of these, of the marginalized.
Yeah, I really appreciated that, especially as you were saying, kind of reading the Black Panther Party and Black radical traditions in general as religious movements. I just thought that was such an innovative thing. At one point in the essay, you said something that really struck me. You say, if we take religion to be more about practices than beliefs, if we take theology to be more about tradition than proposition, and if we take secularization to more often than not mark false consciousness, perhaps there's a way of reading the politics of the Black Panthers as political theology. We'll get into this a little more, I guess, later in the show when we talk about your work on prison abolition. But could you sort of open up a little bit, like, how does your sort of broad understanding of religion play into the Black Panther Party as a religious movement? I mean, that's something a lot of people don't think of it as, and you sort of note that in the beginning, that's sort of a unique way to look at this, or it's something that it doesn't seem very naively intuitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to think about this in several dimensions, from the very basically biographical, right? Newton's father was a Baptist minister, and Newton was exposed to Christianity and participated in sort of Christian church life in his youth. That was formative for him, just on the biographical level, to the way that biblical parables are invoked in the sort of lore around and explication lore around the Black Panther Party and explications of Black Panther positions. To the sort of aesthetics, right? The iconography, the most famous image of Newton sort of sitting behind what's effectively a halo, right? This wicker chair, it's sort of forming a halo behind his head. And of course, most importantly of all, right? Thinking about the ideas, right? The sort of a desire for a dramatic transformation that starts from the perspective of the most marginalized and challenges ideology or idolatry, and sort of builds from the grassroots through sort of disciplined organizing practices in order for social transformation in a way that is pushing in a certain direction without knowing exactly how that path, where that path is going to go. So it seems like, from these most sort of concrete and biographical dimensions, including the Black Panthers building a temple to humanity. They built something that was just like a church in Oakland, but was about celebrating power to the people rather than power to an otherworldly God. But we don't have to read that as necessarily secularism, right? It's another form of a Christian religiosity that might be, read as another kind of theological tradition rather than as a rejection of theological tradition.
So just to pick up a little bit more on that, when you say that it's another theological tradition, I think that really helps to get away from the idea of secularization as how would you put it, like getting rid of the ornaments of religion or something, and then whatever you're left with, like, that's natural politics or natural life or something. And something we kind of have been talking about a little bit on this podcast already is that a lot of life is sort of permeated with these things that we call religious, and that's a really complicated term for a lot of reasons, and you bring that out throughout your essay. And I think one thing I found especially interesting is when you talk about political theology as a critique of idolatry in particular, and how the Panthers are sort of doing that too, like naming these certain idols and, looking to smash them in a certain way. And that's, instead of seeing that as a secularist, whatever, war on mythology or something like that. Like you really pull out how they're doing idolatry critique with their own kind of tools and developing their own kind of vocabulary for that isn't totally divorced from the theological movements that preceded them. I thought that was just a really strong, cool point. Thank you for making that.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes what's off-putting about political theology from the sort of secular critical theory side is the positive content that there are specific beliefs about Jesus or Mary or something that one has to sort of hold in order to sort of think seriously about political theology. Which, I mean, I think there are interesting ways to think about political theology that can be open to both those people approaching the conversation from the sort of secular critical theory side and from the Christian theological side, as well as other religious traditions. And I think that this sort of perspective of negative political theology, right, thinking about political theology as first and foremost the critique of idolatry or ideology, the ideas of the wealthy and powerful that seem natural and are elevated to this sort of quasi-divine perspective, but need to be called into question. I mean, it seems like that's a way of allowing for that the various theological idioms to sort of come together in a politically and sort of justice-oriented project. I guess I would just add on the secularist side, or on the sort of secularism question, that I entirely agree with what you were saying there. I mean, it seems like there's also a story about how secularism links with our particular sort of economic moment, right? That there's something about neoliberalism or the sort of way that culture and economy are configured in the North America these days, that it makes a religion a choice, right, of the individual from a menu that can change one day or the other, that doesn't come with normative commitments, right? You sort of choose the ethics that feels right and all these sorts of things that would go along with the sort of secularist perspective on religiosity, right? It's not just exclusion of religion, but also management of religion by managing how we understand ourselves and how we relate to our desires and choices and ways of relating to institutions. That religion can be just one institution among many that we're relating to when we want to and not when we want to. So bringing that critique of secularism together with the negative political theology seems politically productive to me, at least.
Maybe we can move on to 1 second, though. At least there's this really cool political theology sort of turn, Vincent, you do in your paper, where you say, this is this quote that kind of stuck with me, and I'd love to hear you talk about it more, because I think it gets at some of these initial thoughts about political theology. But you say Huey P Newton followed Malcolm X like Jesus followed John the Baptist. Could you kind of explain that to us a little bit more, or like what you're intending with this?
Mm-hmm. So this is quoting Bobby Seale in his sort of hagiography of Newton, and thinking about the way that Newton was imagined and imagined by his sort of followers, those involved in the Black Panther Party, and sort of represented more generally. And I mean, I think the locating Newton within a religious story, right, that is inescapable. In this case, it's sort of a Christian story. So for those, if we rejecting the sort of secularist premise and seeing ourselves in a North Atlantic context, sort of inescapably shaped by Christian ideas and practices, then it seems like a particularly powerful move to sort of recognize that and advance that tradition by at the same time sort of not inverting it, but locating, reminding an audience that what is so powerful about the story of Jesus' identification with the most marginal and the poor, the incarcerated, the sick, and so on. And so, if following Black theologians were to sort of think about our current situation, our current cultural context, and look for where we think that we will find God incarnated in the most marginalized now. And we think of that not just in a passive sort of charity-oriented way, that, we need to find those sort of the most marginalized in order to help them the most, but rather that we are to find that sites of marginalization in order to learn, right? Because that's where the truth can be found, right? That's where we can learn how to be good, right? By taking lessons from those who are the most marginalized. Then, Newton and those around him sort of setting up this counter-theological or enhanced sort of theological vision of the Black Panther Party, sort of at the center of a Christian theological imaginary, is a sort of a reminder of the epistemic privilege of the oppressed, right? The privilege that those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Yeah, I really like what you were just saying there. It reminds me so I'm Roman Catholic, you teach at Villanova. That's a really cool thing to me. And it just sort of reminds me of the preferential option for the poor that you get in liberation theologies. And as I was reading your essay, I just kept thinking of that famous line from Camilo Torres, the Colombian priest, where he said, if Jesus were alive today, he would be a gorilla. And it sort of seemed like that's the kind of thing that Huey Newton might say if he were a theologian or if he were a pastor. And I wondered, as I was reading, you connect Huey Newton's sort of unique position in the party, in particular, with his exploration of the theme of love. And I was thinking about that and thinking about how the Panthers have a kind of intentionally violent political theology in a way. And one thing we've been talking a little bit on this podcast is about the problem of violence and sort of Christian politics and ethics in general. What do you sort of think about how that plays into the Panthers, both their violence and their political theology? Because, a lot of folks who think about black politics on the left, they immediately go to pacifist movements and civil rights, and this clearly is not doing that. So maybe you could speak a little bit to that problem and how Christianity and violence play into the Black Panther Party as you're reading it as a phenomenon, and Huey Newton in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess on this I would entirely defer to Derek Ford on your podcast before, who I think got it entirely correct, that we think about violence in these sort of personal subjective terms when we should be thinking about sort of structural violence, the violence of systems of the state, the violence that comes along with economic inequality, and the violence that comes along with lack of health care, with lack of public service. So, if we sort of reframe violence in those terms, then it creates a sort of it opens up the discussion much more broadly. And I think those are certainly the terms that Newton and those associated with Black Panthers would think about questions of violence. But I would add, for Newton and for Eldridge Cleaver and for George Jackson, the three sort of iconic writers and thinkers of the Black Panther Party, love is a central theme. Eldridge Cleaver and George Jackson both wrote these widely circulating books, sort of hugely influential in the sort of cultural world of the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, and they're both love letters. Effectively, they're both reflections on their love for another, and sort of in the form of letters. And so, I think thinking, in other work, I've been sort of thinking more seriously about what we can learn about love when we don't start with Martin Luther King, but when we start with Eldridge Cleaver, George Jackson, and Huey Newton. And in a sense, they have a very sort of Augustinian view of love, right? That there's misordering of desires, but in this case, in some ways, in contrast to Augustine, the misordering isn't just sort of individual issue, but it's a systemic issue, right? This economic system, white supremacy, patriarchy, misorder desires, and there can't just be a sort of gradual improvement in the ordering of desires to get them to a rightly ordered state, but there has to be a sort of radical break with those systems, right? There has to be the sort of a direct challenge to white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy in order for it to be possible to move toward rightly ordered desire. So, I mean, it seems like there's a lot to be said there and a lot of possibility for Christian ethical reflection in dialogue with his sort of Black radical tradition.
I find, I mean, like, so you're right. So Derek kind of gave us like a good introduction to that, or a good introductory explanation of that, right? Like that communism, in his case, kind of fights against these movements of like systemic oppression, systemic violence. And that's an argument that I completely get. And but it's still something that like our podcast, and as Dean and I have been talking back and forth, that we've been like struggling with, I guess. I think that the difficulty is like that we both agree, but we know, at least I have so many people in my life, my colleagues, who don't understand that, or who don't quite who can't get to that point. What do you think like the hang up is with this is like a ridiculous question. Who knows who could answer this? But maybe I just want to know what you'd say. What's the hang up with Christians about like personal acts of violence and systematic acts of violence, and the confusion of like which is worse? Because it seems like Christians are like very like hand-wringingly nervous about political action that could end in any type of violence, but they are not at all nervous about systemic violence that just kind of goes on behind our backs. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. What's behind this for us?
Yeah, I don't think it's a specifically Christian issue, right? It seems like it's a ruling class issue, right? Like for the ruling class to maintain its power, right? This sort of individualization of violence, right? That it's this sort of about subjective acts, and the ideal is a sort of nonviolent protester. If you're going to protest, you have to do so nonviolently. I mean, it seems like this is one of these ideas that circulates and is treated in this sort of almost a quasi-divine status, but is actually idolatrous, right? It's a idea that functions to advance the interests of the wealthy and the powerful, but is in fact obscuring what's really happening, right? That violence is much more complex, much more diffuse, and again, I think if we listen to those voices that are most marginalized, and to the sort of struggles of those in the global South, and those in racial and sexual minority communities in North America and elsewhere. I mean, I think those sorts of appreciations for the complexity and systematic nature of violence are what we'll hear if we're properly attuned.
Yeah, thanks. There's a political theorist that this conversation makes me think back to, a guy named Richard Gilman Opolsky, who does lots of work on autonomous Marxism and stuff like that. He has a book that came out not too long ago called Spectres of Revolt. That's what it's called. He has this like funny turn in there though, where he talks about like news outlets sort of decrying riots and protests as violent, and then he has this turn where he says like, well, actually like they're that's probably like the least violent thing going on in the world is like a riot or a march or a protest or something, in sort of like comparison to like the larger systems of systemic injustice or oppression. Yeah, sorry, again, a weird connection that I'm just gonna blurt out. Dean?
Well, maybe we could talk about how that relates to what you're doing, Vincent, in the abolitions piece that we also read. where you're talking about prisons specifically, particularly as a certain kind of violence, a certain systemic kind of violence. And the, if I could call it this way, like the pitch you make with your co-author, Joshua Debler, I hope I pronounced that right, I'm really sorry if I didn't, but the pitch you sort of make in there is that prisons are a religious problem, and so is sort of being against prisons, the abolition movement. Could you say a little bit about that? So how are prisons as a system of violence a religious problem, and then how is resistance to that violence also a religious issue?
Sure, yeah. So in this book that I've written with Josh Dubler that we've written a little bit as an essay that was in Abolition Journal, we're trying to think about how social justice-minded religious communities and secular leftist abolitionists can get on the same page and can struggle together to win an end to the prison system. That these two groups, have a lot in common in terms of their motivations and their goals, but often are speaking very different languages. One a very secular idiom, sort of allergic to the religious; the other sort of allergic to some elements of the sort of vocabulary of secular leftist politics. But if we look back at the abolition movement of the 19th century, right, that was a time when political theology sort of was the way that movement organizing happened and won. And if we imagine North America still as deeply shaped by and formed by a religious tradition and practice and affect and symbols, then we can see the potential for mobilizing that religiosity for a sort of winning political movement against incarceration. So we want to do that. Josh and I want to do that by thinking both about the history of the prison, as you mentioned. So not only thinking about the origins of the prison and the penitentiary, right, these sort of practices of being alone with yourself and looking into your soul and finding your guilt, right, but more specifically about mass incarceration, about how the religious ethical language of justice changed before the 1970s and after the 1970s, so before the moment when exponential prison growth began in the U.S. context. There was once circulating widely, right, in political rhetoric, in the words and ideas of those incarcerated in religious communities, these sort of expansive visions of justice that motivated action, right? That politicians would say we need to change the laws so that we can get closer to achieving justice in the nation or in other contexts. And that expansive vision of justice goes away, right? It was once associated with a sort of higher law, with a sort of kingdom of God, divine justice, all this sort of thing, as a sort of direction in which the laws should be changed. Justice comes to mean the criminal justice system, right? Justice comes to mean just following the law properly. It's sort of a hollowing out of the meaning of justice, which comes about from we argue a sort of loss of religious imagination, a religious ethical imagination, when that secularism sort of excludes the religious content of justice. We're just left with this desiccated meaning of justice as simply following the law, which makes possible, the sort of law and order politics that exponential prison growth is a symptom of. We think, of course, there are racial reasons, economic reasons that the prison population exploded, but this religious ethical component we think is an important and undertold part of the story, and by telling that part of the story, we can motivate religious communities and those spiritual but not religious communities, which is many people in North America, to join together and think creatively about how prison abolition might be possible.
So you're just mentioning a few things about like the tradition of abolition culture in America, or that at least one exists. And I wonder, okay, people are pretty, I guess, unhappy with like sort of the American identity right now, the U.S. identity. There's lots to be unhappy about. There's a lot of just generally bad things about the U.S. at this point, imperialism, presidents aside. But there's this quote from the article in Abolitions that I really am interested in hearing about as well. You say, just as America has a prison culture, America also has an abolition culture. Just as American prison culture is religious, American abolition culture is also religious. So I wonder what it means to be an American and a religious person in America in light of like the American abolition culture. Like what are the retrievals we should be going for? Like what are the things that we should reach back into like the abolition culture and find and try to repurpose? Do you have anything in mind specifically?
Sure. So one of the things that we're trying to do in this project is think about an abolition spirit, which is exemplified at particular moments, like 19th century abolition movements against slavery, also like the prison strikes in Georgia and California and Alabama over the last few years, but also to think about an abolition spirit that goes beyond any of these particular instances, a spirit that consists of both saying a negative rejection of injustice, even when it's not clear what the path forward is, right? So saying, for example, as some organizers have in recent years, no more prison construction. Even when there's prison overcrowding, the natural response might be to build new prisons, but this abolitionist posture would be to say no to that, even if we don't know how everything is going to work out in the end, which is also very religious sort of posture, right? To this sort of negation of worldly injustice without seeing the path, the sort of pragmatic path forward to a vision of to how things will be better in 5 or 10 or 20 years. That sort of policy oriented perspective that sort of drives the conversation. But also equally important to that sort of negative element to this abolitionist spirit is an affirmative dimension, right? One that comes, after the change of laws, right, with the abolition of slavery, right, is all sorts of often black church-led reconstruction of democratic institutions and social democracy in the face of great resistance in the South. So Gary Dorian has a great new book thinking about the way that the black social gospel tradition was reweaving the social fabric, building up democratic institutions after the Civil War. In a way that sort of drew on specifically Christian commitments and saw, that building up of democracy as equally part of abolitionism as the negation, right, as the rejection of the system of slavery. And I mean, I think Angela Davis has done a great job of speaking about abolition democracy, right? That abolitionism can't just be a rejection; it has to be. And it has always been, at its best, a combination of a negative and an affirmative posture, which, it seems like the Christian tradition has particularly good resources in both of these directions, both the negative and the affirmative, both the saying no without knowing the path forward and the, working, struggling in the present to build up the social institutions that could bring about the something like the kingdom of God.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And it also, as you're talking, I was just thinking more about the Black Panther Party in particular. And then you mentioned Derek earlier, who outside the podcast context. And when we had Derek on as the episode, for his episode, we were talking about party movements and, how do you organize people? And the Black Panthers were a party, right? So what do you think about sort of as we build an affirmative movement and also a movement that is sort of organized enough to say no in a way that matters? Do you think that party movements are a way of doing that? Do you think in your work on religious communities that churches are a way of doing that? Is there a sort of blurry boundary between churches and parties or something? I don't know. Those are just some associations that are coming up for me. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and I don't think we need to be overly invested in demarcating what is a political party and what is a church. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of blurriness there, and both at their best are probably doing the same thing in terms of fostering a sense of community that involves discipline, involves orientation toward social justice end, which can't be perfectly imagined in the present, where that goes beyond the pragmatic, that goes beyond a sort of policy orientation that provides a space for reflection and collective reflection that might not be there in when one is immersed fully in struggle. So I mean, it seems like all of these sort of virtues of community and organized community are important and really are prerequisites to successful struggle. And this sort of community can be found in lots of different forms.
So Vincent, you were just saying that organization is important, and it's hard to imagine how these things play out sort of currently, but in the open-ended future of possible movements of abolition, organizing people for those ends is good and possible, and the party, the church, it's all happening. But yeah, I do teach undergrads, people who will go into those parties and churches, and I'm trying to think of ways to get them to change the way they think about incarceration in general, because my preconceived notion, and from the conversations I've had with some students, is that they don't really think about it, or that it's just a really peripheral topic to them, something that's they know prisons exist and they know bad people go there or whatever, but how would you start to provoke the uninitiated into this conversation? How would you move people into thinking more critically about these social institutions and about justice?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, so first, I think we're at an exciting moment where, for the first time since the early 1970s, mass incarceration is on public radio, in the New York Times, right? It's sort of in mainstream media in a way that it, for the last 40 years, was not, and the problem got worse and worse and worse, and it was largely invisible in the sort of mainstream public media platforms. I mean, I think there's something nice about the moment now, and that there are resources like the Brian Stevenson book, the Michelle Alexander book, right? There are resources out there that people who are interested can find, and compelling stories. I mean, I think just as a starting point, the sort of basic statistics about incarceration rates in the U.S. versus countries, every other country, and then right, like the violent crime rate in the U.S. versus every other country. Right? I think there's often an image that the U.S. is so much more violent than other countries because we hear about these school shootings and that sort of thing. But I mean, when you actually look at the numbers, the U.S. Is maybe slightly higher than average, but certainly not an order of magnitude greater, and certainly less. There's less violent crime than some other similarly situated countries. So, I mean, the sort of disparity between this giant incarceration rate and the violent crime rate seems important. I mean, I think the stories about the racial disparities can be very compelling. I mean, thinking about the more than 50% chance that African-American men who don't go to high school and spend some time in the justice system. I mean, it seems like there are these sort of statistics that can be so compelling to sort of motivate further inquiry and interest. And I think the voter suppression element particularly now when there's a lot of passion around the election, right? Just thinking about the number of voters who were disenfranchised because of past criminal convictions, who could have voted in the last election and sort of changed the sort of political landscape. So there are a lot of sort of points of entry that seem compelling to the conversation these days. Which I think one of the challenges is that there are also points of entry that lead to sort of technocratic or policy-oriented solutions, right? Like the cost of incarceration, just in terms of the financial cost, right, is very high, and it's something that can motivate people to be concerned about incarceration, but just finding cheaper solutions may lead to finding less humane solutions as well, right? Yeah. So it seems like keeping that sort of religious, ethical perspective as we sort of think about the issue is really important, and something that's been missing, I think, from the discussions around incarceration, not only in this wave, but also in the earlier wave in the 70s, when there were a dozen Michelle Alexanders running around, sort of capturing the public interest around the problems with incarceration and the possibilities of abolition, and then the prison population exploded. So we don't want that to happen again. And I think the more that religious, ethical imagination can be invoked, the better chance we have of preventing that from happening again.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and I agree. That's a great starting point. Just kind of exposing like the statistical truth of the situation. I think that's super shocking, and will definitely provoke some interesting conversations. But there's also like, in your article, you said that it's like a religious problem too. And my students are undergrads, first of all, and they're also Christians at a Christian college, and that Christian rhetoric that is ingrained into into incarcerations, I think will be particularly hard for them to overcome. And like statistics, I think will be great, but I imagine that some of them will still feel like we'll fall back on that ideology that people who have transgressed justice have to be imprisoned for whatever reason. It seems like there's like something just like even far, like there's something ideological going on there that I think I'll have a hard time accounting for just through statistics. So what are the specifically religious ways do you think to kind of overcome the ideological like boundedness to people thinking about incarceration?
Mm-hmm. So if I could connect that question with another question that always sort of comes up is, what does one do with all the bad people when prisons are abolished? Yeah. Right? So the first answer to that would be, to think about the badness that's happening now versus the badness that would happen if everyone is released tomorrow. There would be problems with that, but are those problems worse than the injustices and inhumanity and indignity that is happening today because of the incarceration? It seems like a difficult thing to say. But more generally, one of the things that we tried to do in this project that Josh and I tried to do is, look at the way that religious communities have responded over the last half century, particularly in the North American context, but also in Scandinavia and the Netherlands, to incarceration, and thinking about restorative justice models, thinking about going back to biblical traditions of justice and as a right ordering of community, and ways that might be implemented. And I think one of the promising things is that from the liberal Protestants to the evangelicals to the Mennonites and Quakers, right, there's been a variety of ways in which alternatives to incarceration have been theorized and begun to be and experimented with. And so, I think one of the challenges, again, which is a challenge of secularism, right, is to remember the religious roots of these alternatives to incarceration and hold them up, right? That restorative justice or transformative justice, these or alternative courts, these sorts of ways to bring a so-called victim and offender together with their families, with their neighbors, with their community, and restore peace in the neighborhood, or move toward that, or figure out what a path would be for that community to be restored. I mean, that can become just an appendage of the criminal justice system, right? Or appendage of the policing system, which can be bad. It can be part of the nonprofit industrial complex, which can be ambivalent, or it can be something that comes from the grassroots, is motivated by a sort of abolitionist spirit, right? A mindset that is really trying to think toward social democracy, reject idolatry and ideology, reject domination in all its forms. And I mean, I think we find that best vision of restorative justice in these religious communities which have been experimenting with restorative justice models over the last half century.
Okay, awesome. Vincent, thanks so much for talking with us. We really appreciate you being here and just giving us some of your thoughts on abolition and political theology. It's been a really great and instructive conversation. Do you want to plug your book or an essay?
Yeah, I mean, so I can say the Huey Newton essay is a chapter in this book called Religion of the Field Negro on Black Secularism and Black Theology, which should be out in the fall from Fordham University Press. The prison stuff is part of, with Josh Dubler, is part of Break Every Yoke, Religion, Justice, and the Abolition of Prisons, which should hopefully be out next summer. And the Eldridge Cleaver and George Jackson stuff is part of an edited volume called Anti-Blackness and Christian Ethics that Orbis is putting out in the fall, that I co-edited with Andrew Prevost, bringing together Christian theologians to respond to Black Lives Matter, and sort of featuring both the sort of established, more senior voices, but also younger voices thinking in dialogue with the movement.
All right, thanks again, Vincent, for talking with us. Everyone, obviously, go buy Vincent's books, read his articles. We'll link to them in the show notes so you can find them more easily. So thanks for listening to Magnificast. Make sure you follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, scrabble us on SoundCloud, subscribe to us on iTunes. I don't know. It's all very exhausting, but you're listening to the podcast now. Make sure you listen to it in the future. All right. To conclude, I'm going to ask Vincent to read the last paragraph in his Abolitions article because it's very good. So here it is.
Today, we invite our comrades on the secular left to provincialize their secularism, just as we invite our religious sisters and brothers to transcend their reformism. We are not calling for abolition theology. Whether you believe in God or don't believe in God isn't, to us, the important thing. We are calling for, rather, religion. In an expansive, critical, and practical sense, religion must be woven into the growing prison abolition movement. In righteous struggle, as spiritual revival, let us conjure together the spirit of abolitionism, and let us tumble the prison walls down.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. You keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up.